They remembered the story of how they had come to be, not as individuals, but as a people. Long ago, a human spaceship had crash-landed on this water world. Realizing they could not survive or escape, the crew had done something strange and brilliant. They used their advanced knowledge of genetics to engineer tiny human offspring, microscopic, aquatic, and adapted to the puddle-sized oceans of this strange world. These tiny humans, barely larger than microbes, lived not in cities, but in coral-like structures, moving through water thick with life forms hundreds of times their size. One such colony, called Hydrot, sat nestled in the curve of a mossy rock that loomed like a mountain above the tiny sea folk. Hydrot thrived, generations deep into their history. The past was spoken of as myth, passed through the oral teachings of the memory keeper, who recited how they had been made from the bodies of giants, whose hands shaped the very laws of life and adaptation. These tales were not taken lightly. They were sacred, and they were real. Young Levon, a curious member of the new generation, had always felt a strange calling. He looked often at the surface of the water above, where faint light played and dark shapes shifted in blurry motions. They called it the barrier. It shimmered, impenetrable and cold, a wall of mystery. It was said that nothing could live beyond it, that the world ended there. Yet Levon couldn't let the idea go. Below the barrier, life was complex and constant. Gigantic amoeba-like creatures drifted through the current. Filter feeders the size of houses swept through microscopic jungles of algae, their waving cilia sending tremors across the seabed. Here, among these moving ecosystems, the people of Hydrot had built their lives, taming currents, growing biosynthetic food pods, and learning to navigate the slow violence of nature. It was a life measured not by decades, but by chemical tides and pulse cycles in the water. Levon had been trained as a navigator. He had learned how to build and guide a sail creature, an organic machine grown like coral, shaped like a manta ray. It moved through the water with quiet grace, powered by biological muscles and guided by chemical signals from its rider. These sail creatures had made it possible to travel far, to link distant colonies together, to map the puddle seas that had once been nothing but chaos. But none had ever reached the barrier. None had dared. Except Levon. He wasn't alone in his dream. 4 others joined him, each of them different in skill and strength. Real, a biotinkerer who could shape the genetics of seaweed into tools. Merla, the storykeeper's daughter who knew the myths and the science intertwined. Hanar, a powerful swimmer with limbs as flexible as seagrass. And Dorn, a quiet, intense thinker who believed the past was not just memory but blueprint. They grew their sail creature from scratch. It took many cycles. With patience, they wove the tissues, spliced DNA from fast-swimming plankton, added navigation flares that pulsed bioluminescent patterns. Their vessel was not just alive, it was aware, gently bonded to their emotional frequencies. They named it Seeker. On the day of departure, the entire colony gathered. Some whispered blessings. Others argued they were throwing their lives away. But when Seeker uncurled its wing-like fins and lifted into the warm currents, all fell silent. They journeyed for many tide cycles, passing through regions of danger and wonder. Forests of undulating tendrils waved like alien kelp. Transparent predators lurked in the shadows, pulsing with inner light. They evaded them with clever maneuvers, with Ryle's chemical defenses, with Levon's precise steering. And then finally, the water darkened. Not from depth, but from proximity to the barrier. It was here, a dome of tension where surface met world, a wall they could see, but not pass through. Seeker floated close and its fins twitched nervously. Levon swam ahead, reaching his hand toward the film. It resisted him with a strange pressure, neither solid nor liquid. It shimmered and then pushed back. "We're not built to pass," Dorn said, his voice low and certain. "It's what the elders always said. We were made for this world, not the one above." "But what if we change ourselves?" Rel asked softly. "What if we evolve like our creators intended?" Merla's eyes were wide with awe. Maybe they didn't just make us to survive. Maybe they made us to reach. They returned to Hydrot with samples, data, stories, and something more, a vision. They began work on the project. It wasn't just science. It was belief. They would engineer a new being, one that could pass the barrier. It would be like them, yet not. It would have lungs, not gills. It would be able to breathe air, walk on solids, survive beyond the water. Generations passed. The project became central to Hydrot's culture. Sculptors of DNA created embryo after embryo. Most failed. But finally, one survived. They named her Quora. She grew in a translucent womb of nutrient gel. Her limbs were flexible but strong. Her skin was layered to retain moisture. Her eyes could filter both light and airwaves. She was a hybrid, the bridge between water and sky. Quora learned quickly. She heard the stories of the past, of the giants who had made their people, and of the barrier which no one had passed. She played in the currents, but always her gaze went upward. Always she dreamed of the surface. On the day of her trial, the colony gathered again. Seeker, still alive after all these cycles, had grown larger, more intelligent. It was bonded now to Quora, and it carried her gently through the deep toward the edge. The barrier shimmered again, but Quora swam with confidence. She pressed against the surface and pushed. There was resistance, and then she broke through. The world above was blinding at first. Light poured in waves from the sky. The air was thin and cold, but she breathed it. She stood on trembling legs atop a wet stone, looking across a vast plain of puddles, glistening in the sun. She saw movement, in the distance shapes. Gigantic insects? No, machines. Explorers from another ship. New humans. She opened her mouth to speak. Her voice was rough but audible. "I am from below," she said. They stared in awe. Behind her in the puddle, Seeker waited, watching with slow blinking lights. Below it, the people of Hydrot looked up. Quora had crossed the barrier, and everything had changed. In the dim world of the Puddle Sea, where tiny trees of algae stretched like forests and towering stalks of protozoa swayed in slow underwater breezes, the descendants of those miniaturized humans lived and thrived. They were known as the People, born not of nature but of engineering, left behind by Earth's explorers who had long since vanished. Elwar, the thinker and builder, stared beyond the protective dome of the settlement, past the swirling sediments that marked the limits of their known world. His mind spun with questions of the surface, a forbidden word among the elders, whispered like a myth. To most of the people, the surface was a death place, dry and far above the water, impossible to reach. But to Elwar, it was an idea that could not be forgotten. He worked tirelessly in his lab, shaping his thoughts into forms, designing something that had never existed before in their world. A vessel that could move beyond the puddle, past the rim, and across the dry land. A sailor, he called it. But propulsion through air was as foreign to the people as walking on stone. Their fins, adapted for their aquatic world, were not suited for anything beyond. Yet Elwar imagined a craft powered by muscle and buoyancy, propelled like the swimming beetles he studied in the outer waters. Not everyone believed in his vision. The elders warned of distraction, heresy, and the sin of ungratefulness. After all, they owed their lives to the careful design of their Earth ancestors. The puddle world was their home, their limit, their sky. But Elwar countered, if the ancients had not meant for them to grow, why were they gifted with minds that reached? As he worked, he was joined by Grell, a quiet and observant companion who saw value in Elwar's dreams. Together, they built the hull from hardened mucilage and tension-cured tendons, testing models in the shallow bays where the pressure of the water changed. They learned from the water bugs and how they trapped air, from floating seeds that used hairs to drift on the breeze. They studied the surface tension, that delicate but strong film that marked the border between worlds. They understood that crossing it was not just a journey, it was a breaking of laws. But with each failure, their sailor grew more refined, more ready. Elwar spoke of it like a calling. He believed that the minds of their people had begun to atrophy under the weight of comfort, that their spirits had once reached the stars and could again. Grell didn't speak as passionately, but his hands worked just as hard, shaping the frame, fusing the bindings. When the craft was ready, it was only the size of a leaf, yet it gleamed like nothing their kind had ever made. Its core held a precious bubble of air, stolen from a water bug nest. Its wings shimmered with the slime of dragonfly larvae, rigid and light. They tested it near the surface, where the light bent strangely and the water felt different, less forgiving. The first time they tried, it crumpled. The second time, it flipped. The third time, it rose, briefly, for a moment, until it settled back again. Still, they persisted. Grell was the one who discovered the launch trough. a smooth-edged stone slope that angled upward near the puddle's edge. It had just the right geometry for momentum. They knew this would be their final attempt. Elwar summoned the few who believed, curious younglings and builders who had dared to wonder. In silence, they watched the vessel rest atop the launch, held in tension. Then, they let it go. With a springing motion and the flex of stored tension, the sailor sliced upward through the film of the surface. The people had never seen such a thing. The water broke and healed behind it, the surface tension flexing and then snapping closed. For a moment, Elwar and Grell were gone. On the other side, they lay stunned inside the vessel, gasping in the foreign air. Around them was dry land, immense, ungraspable. The air was sharp and unfiltered. Shadows played across them from shapes far too large to understand. The world was a desert of incomprehensible scale. Their puddle, from which they had come, shimmered behind them like a jewel. They had done it. The first people to leave the water. For a long time, they said nothing, watching the dry world unfold around them. They were not meant to survive here for long. They knew that. Their skin would dry, their organs fail, but in the vessel with its moist core and precious air reserves, they lasted hours, long enough to observe the world above. They recorded what they could, transmitting through a tethered line that trailed back into the water, carrying pulses of signal and breath. What they saw was not chaos, but stillness. It was a place where the wind whispered, but did not carry voices, where light burned without distortion. They strange insects, gigantic, slow, majestic. They saw patches of moss that looked like forests, and shadows that moved in spirals. They saw things no people had ever seen. But time pressed in. Grell, always cautious, signaled they should return. Their vessel, designed for exit, could not easily re-enter the puddle's world. Surface tension, which had once resisted them from below, now resisted them from above. The barrier was a mirror and a wall. Elwar hesitated. He wanted more time, more sight, more world. Grell did not wait. With a weighted glide, he angled the vessel back toward the puddle. It struck the surface. The water quivered. The tension held. Then finally, it gave and they sank back through. Below, the watchers gasped as the sailor broke back into their world, wobbling as it drifted down. They rushed to meet it, pulling it back into the embrace of the liquid. Elwar and Grell emerged exhausted, transformed, wordless. But their eyes told everything. They had seen the other side, and something had shifted, not just in them, but in everyone. The knowledge that it could be done. That the surface was not an end, but a border. Elwar spent days recovering, speaking only when necessary. Grell returned to work with the same quiet resolve, but there was now a light in him that others noticed. The elders held council after council, debating what it meant. But for the younger builders, the dream had already taken root. New sailors were designed, variations tested. The surface was no longer myth, it was possibility. And even more importantly, it was not the end. Far above the surface, there were stars. The people, born in a puddle, born from those who had once traversed the galaxy, began to wonder what lay beyond the land. The story of the sailor was told again and again, not just for its triumph, but for its reminder. The world was greater than what they knew. The puddle would always be home, but it would never again be the limit. The first voyage beyond the surface had changed them all. The Mesotron, the spore ship their ancestors had engineered as both myth and blueprint, had finally lifted from the briny pool, rising up from the surface tension into the unknown world above. The journey had been perilous, and the crew, Baal, Merla, and the others, had seen wonders none in their community could have imagined. Forests of hair-like grass, vast plains of dry, cracked terrain, and distant glimmers of reflective waters beyond. But their triumph did not bring comfort. Upon returning, they found their people changed, their minds heavy with disbelief and fear. The Mesotron had become a symbol not only of what lay beyond, but of what might be lost. The microcosmic society that had once known only the currents, the pressure shifts, and the gentle pulse of their puddle's ecology now stood on the edge of a precipice. Discovery had brought them knowledge, but it had also brought isolation. Baal and the others tried to share what they had seen. The wide surface, the wind that moved without current, the dry world where no fins could swim. They spoke of scale, the immense size of the world above. But many in the community could not accept it. Their myths had spoken of the sky, but to witness it was to fracture belief. Some thought the Mesotron a lie, Others feared what their own minds conjured now when they looked upward toward the glittering skin of their puddle. Even those who had believed in the voyage began to feel disoriented. Bal often stared at the surface above, his thoughts drifting. He knew the boundaries of their puddle were just the beginning. If this was the size of a single drop, what kind of being had built the original seed ship that had brought their ancestors here? What world had they left behind? One night, Bal and Merla returned to the edge of the pool where they had first begun construction of the mesotron. The coral frames and kelp fiber lattices were still there, but overgrown now, forgotten by the others. "We changed something," Merla said softly, her voice vibrating through the liquid in harmonic ripples, "even if no one follows us again." "They will," Bal replied. "One day. Maybe not soon, but one day." From their perch on a frond, they watched bioluminescent creatures spiral upward toward the surface. Above, tiny insects walked across the tension skin like gods. To Bal, they now looked less like titans and more like the same struggles in a different shape, creatures following instinct, trying to live in a world too big for understanding. The community split over time. A few young ones came to Bal, hungry for more knowledge. Others turned inward, deepening their rituals and isolating from the explorers. Bal taught what he could: construction principles of the mesotron, the memory of the first ascent, how to prepare one's mind for scale and for silence. And always there were the questions. "Are we truly human?" a student once asked. Bal had no easy answer, not in the way the ancestors were, but we are what they became. What mattered to them wasn't shape, it was will. We chose to look upward. Years passed, another generation grew. The original crew of the mesotron aged, their membranes becoming translucent with time. Their swimming slower but more deliberate. And then, one by one, they passed, leaving stories behind and fragments of ship design etched into calcium slabs. Eventually, the community built a second mesotron. This time it was larger, designed for more passengers. They launched it not for exploration, but for migration. The pool had begun to dry, and the time had come to find another refuge. This new journey was not one of curiosity, it was necessity. And so they rose again, breaking the surface tension in a trembling sphere of light and will, leaving the puddle behind, rising into a land that had once seemed unthinkable. As the sky unfolded above them, vast and unknowable, the horizon curved into distance. Below, the puddle shrank to a glimmer. The world they had known, its monsters, its coral cities, its ecosystems of single-celled color and light, faded into memory. They did not know what lay ahead, but Bal's words had become part of their myth now. We chose to look upward. Far beyond, in the dry lands of this strange planet, new puddles shimmered in the sun. Some had different salinities, some held entirely alien microbes, some were lifeless. Some pulsed with primitive colonies not unlike the earliest ones their own ancestors had built. When they descended again, they would bring stories of tides and tension, of coral latticework and voyages across scales. They would tell of sea beasts made of glass and bubbles, and of the sky that once seemed like a lid but was only the beginning. Generations would pass again. Others would build, others would rise. And somewhere, maybe far beyond even the stretch of this planet, their descendants would one day ask, what was it like before the first voyage? And the answer would rise gently, like the ripple of a fin through still water. It began in a drop, and we dared to leave.